Hello, good morning, and welcome to Unacademy, a one-stop destination for the English medium civil services aspirants. Let's get started with the analysis of today's The Hindu newspaper. These are the topics that we shall be discussing today. Should you need the PDF of this lecture, it will be available on my Telegram channel. The link to join that Telegram channel is provided in the comment section. But before we start, an update on our NCERT free course, which we launched last week, and we have already covered 3 lectures. Today we will cover lecture number 4 at 6 p.m. and we shall discuss executive. And all you need to do to attend this free course is to support us through your likes, comments, and subscribe to our channel if you haven't yet. Let's get started and let's look at topic number 1, an editorial in today's The Hindu newspaper, Delhi edition, Unwanted Curbs. Information Technology Act was passed in the year 2000. And a law passed by the parliament, then to implement it, there are rules to be made, and that is what we call delegated legislation. Rules were made number of times, for example in 2021 as well, but significant amendments, changes were made to these rules. The year was 2023, popularly called as the IT rules. These rules were notified in the year 2023, April. Now what these rules tell us? There is Press Information Bureau, which is the publicity arm, the media arm of the Government of India, which works under the control of Ministry of Information and Broadcasting. Under this PIB, there is a unit called Fact Check Unit. But listen to me carefully. This is not something new. In fact, in November 2019, this fact check unit was set up under the Press Information Bureau, which is under the control of the Ministry of Information and Broadcasting. But something happened because of these rules. And when these rules were notified specific to fact check unit this year in March, just before the Lok Sabha elections of 2024. Now, what is this fact check unit doing? And I told you that this fact check unit is there since the last 5 years. What it would do, it would flag, let's say, WhatsApp forwards, YouTube videos, links, content on the digital media, even the newspaper websites as well. It would flag content as either fake, false, or misleading. Now, what is the difference? For example, this fact check unit under the Press Information Bureau has been flagging WhatsApp forwards, YouTube videos, newspaper articles as either false, fake, or misleading. For example, if you have received a WhatsApp forward that Government of India is giving free recharge for 3 months, this is flagged as fake by the Press Information Bureau's fact check unit. That's it. Or if there is a statement, or if there is a newspaper article, or if there is a content on digital media which is misleading. For example, when the Citizenship Amendment Act of 2019 was passed and then it was notified in 2024, this Citizenship Amendment Act fast tracks citizenship to those who have come from Pakistan, Afghanistan, Bangladesh, who belong to the 6 religious minorities of these 3 countries. But it does not snatch the citizenship of Indian Muslims. Al Jazeera published a tweet saying India implements anti-Muslim 2019 law related to citizenship. This was flagged as misleading by this fact check unit of Press Information Bureau. So any content could have been flagged by this fact check unit of the PIB as false, fake, or misleading. But this was specific to the business of the central government. That means anything to do with the central government, any information, any content, any tweet, any video which talks about the business of the central government, under which the central government has the power, role, responsibility, it could have been flagged either as false, fake or misleading by this fact check unit of the Press Information Bureau. But what changed because of these rules which were notified in 2023? These rules provided legal mechanism to this fact check unit. And what is this legal mechanism? For that you need to understand there is a provision called safe harbor protection. And what is this safe harbor protection? For example, you have a Twitter account, an X account, a Facebook account, a WhatsApp account, an Instagram account, and you are posting something which is defamatory. You are posting something which is misleading. You are posting something which disturbs the public order in the society. Will that make the owner of these sites accountable or legally responsible? That means for the content that you post on these social networking sites, will the owner, will the organizations be held responsible for the actions of the users? No. That is what we call safe harbor protection. But what these 2023 IT rules did to this fact check unit of the PIB was, once this fact check unit of the PIB would flag any content as false, fake or misleading, then it becomes mandatory for these social media networking sites, or for that matter any website which is hosting this content which is false, fake or misleading, to take down that content. If you can't take down that content within the amount of time specified by the government, then you will lose your safe harbor protection. Satirist, comedian Kunal Kamra and others approached the Bombay High Court, challenged the validity of these rules with specific reference to this fact check unit, because ultimately it will amount to, according to these petitioners, censorship. Matter went to the Bombay High Court, and Bombay High Court in January this year, 2024, gave a split verdict. Split verdict means that there were two judges on the panel, on the bench, who had to decide whether these rules are legal or illegal, constitutional or unconstitutional, and both the judges disagreed with each other. So there was a split judgment. Ultimately, matter went to the Supreme Court, and Supreme Court directed that a third judge should be set up, and this third judge will now decide whether these rules are constitutional or unconstitutional. And now this third judge of the Bombay High Court has declared that these rules related to the fact check unit under the PIB is unconstitutional. Just before the 2024 Lok Sabha elections in March, this fact check unit was notified. And then it was also stayed by the Supreme Court. And Supreme Court said, since we are in the middle of the parliamentary elections, and if this fact check unit of the PIB would flag any content as false, fake or misleading, and if this content deals with the business of the central government, and then these social media networking sites will lose their safe harbor protection, then any criticism of the government by the opposition political parties during the conduct of the Lok Sabha election would not lead to a level playing field, because any criticism of the central government by the opposition political parties in the form of tweets or videos or newspaper articles would have to be taken down by these social networking sites, which basically means that political education, which is the hallmark of a vibrant, flourishing democracy, would have come to an end, would have been violated. So Supreme Court stayed this fact check unit and allowed the Bombay High Court, a third judge of the Bombay High Court, to declare whether these rules are constitutional or unconstitutional. And now finally, this third judge has said it is unconstitutional. Why? Because when you look at these terms, false, fake, misleading, the judge said these are vague. When these are vague, that means they are not properly defined. When they are not properly defined, that means they are liable to misuse, to abuse, to hyperuse, and ultimately it will kill dissent or freedom of speech and expression in the society. The court further said that when it comes to freedom of speech and expression, under Article 19(1)(a) of the Constitution, it is not an absolute fundamental right that we know. It comes under reasonable restrictions imposed by the Constitution itself under Article 19, Clause 2. But what are the grounds on the basis of which your freedom of speech and expression can be restricted? There are 8 grounds. Sovereignty and integrity of India, security of the state, friendly relations with foreign states, public order, morality or decency, defamation, contempt of court, incitement to an offense. There is no such restriction on your freedom of speech and expression to say whether this speech is true or false. Yes, if this speech, if the content results in the violation of public order, it can be struck down, limits can be imposed, curbs can be imposed, but there is no such thing as restriction on your freedom of speech and expression on the grounds that what you are saying is not true or is false. Because in competing narratives, you have your own version of truth. I have my own version of the truth. That's what writer Amish Tripathi also writes. There is your truth, there is my truth. So far as the only truth and the absolute truth is concerned, it does not exist. So just because a content is not true or false, that does not mean we will have to restrict it, because such grounds are non-existent under Article 19, Clause 2 of the Constitution. Now, what this editorial also talks about, this editorial says that yes, we need to curb misleading narratives or false narratives or fake narratives. But for that, should this power be given to the government? Because then any criticism of the government can be pulled down from the networking sites. That means we need an independent authority, an independent body, which can look into the content on the digital media and flag those issues which are false, fake, misleading, or which spread hate news in the society, which promote hate speeches in the society. But that is not the responsibility that we can entrust the government. For that, we need an independent regulator. The government also had its own point of view. The government said, we have a business to run, which means whether the trains are running on time or not, we have that information. What if there is a random tweet or a random Facebook post which says for the last 3 days, trains have not been running on time? It is the responsibility of the central government to claim, to flag that this is misleading claim, because otherwise the authority of the central government would be vanishing. Because if we as the central government, we have the access to the information, when we have the access to the information, and if somebody is building false, fake, misleading narratives, we have the right to counter it. For that, critics argue that one thing you could do, which you were in any case doing, was to flag such tweets or content as either false, fake, or misleading. But that should not give you the power to order the networking sites, the companies, that you take down this content. Otherwise, you will lose your safe harbor protection. That is something that we should not empower the governments with, because ultimately, freedom of speech and expression, which is sacrosanct, would be diluted, violated, and rendered in nullity. That's what you need to understand from this newspaper article, from this editorial. Now, let's look at another important article on page number 1 of the Delhi edition of the Hindu, relevant for GS paper 2, International Relations. Quad launches maritime health initiatives, condemns aggression in disputed regions. Now, can you tell me, when was this Quad launched? Quadrilateral initiative of countries such as India, Australia, Japan, and United States of America. So for the prelims examination perspective, you need to know who are these countries who are part of Quad: India, Australia, Japan, and United States. When was this Quad formed? Some of you might find it surprising, but it was in the year 2004 when Indian Ocean tsunami wrecked this region. Ultimately, some sort of collaborative exercise so that we can rehabilitate and provide relief to those who were affected by this Indian Ocean tsunami. The Quad was set up in the year 2004. Efforts were made to broaden the scope of Quad in 2007, did not materialize, and this Quad was abandoned, dissolved in the year 2008. But then since 2017, again efforts were made to revive Quad, and since 2021, we have had multiple yearly summits of this Quad amongst the leaders of these four important countries. In fact, foreign ministers of these countries, they also meet under this Quad. But the point is, you need to understand that when it was about to be formalized in 2017 onwards, at that time there was rising concerns about China and how China is expanding its territory, how China is acting as a bully, an economic superpower, and controlling the regions in the Pacific Ocean. And China has been facing issues with Japan, with even its friend Russia, with South Korea, with Australia, and not to forget Philippines, and not to forget India as well. So there was a broad consensus amongst the world leaders that we should somehow curb the expansionist tendency and urge of China in the Pacific Ocean, particularly in the South China Sea. And then what happened? Joe Biden, who is currently the President of the United States, hosted his last Quad summit because he is not going to run for the presidential elections again. And now these Quad leaders have met close to 6 times over the past 4 years. Sometimes these facts have also been asked in the prelims examination. But when this Quad summit was conducted recently, when Mr. Modi, as the Prime Minister of India, also visited the United States, ultimately there was agreement on various wide-ranging topics. For example, how can these 4 countries pool money together and lead to a global war against the cervical cancer? How can we cooperate on cybersecurity? We should also lead to joint port development. So wide-ranging agreements were signed recently when it comes to how do we curb cervical cancers, how do we cooperate on cybersecurity, how do we ensure that we jointly develop ports. And in fact, on May 3, which is a maritime initiative for training in the Indo-Pacific, the first workshop on this would be carried out, would be hosted by India next year in 2025. But there are critics to Quad who say that every time whenever Quad meets, they hold discussions, negotiations, and they sign agreements on multiple issues every single year. And all these things are small bear. Small bear in the sense these are unimportant. Then according to critics, what is important? They say for this Quad, there should be a secretariat which should coordinate amongst these 4 important countries. And ultimately, the Quad should be viewed as a military bloc against the rising influence of China in our neighborhood. Because inherently, although not explicitly, but all the countries know that these four countries have come together with the singular objective of countering the influence of China in our neighborhood. But India does not agree. India does not want this Quad to become a military bloc, because our relationship with China would get affected, because we have our own problems with China, and China should not view this Quad as a military alliance against itself. And it also goes against our foreign policy of non-alignment. We should not be part of any military bloc, any power bloc. In fact, there was a time after the Second World War when the world became bipolar, when United States and USSR emerged as two superpowers of the world. But gradually, the influence of Russia has been dwindling. It was also dismembered in 1991. Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. And with the collapse of Soviet Union, now the world is seeing the rise of China. So some argue now there are two power blocs in the world, United States and China. And United States and China, they have had their own history of relationship going up and down. Tariffs were imposed on Chinese imports by United States. China retaliated. So in United States is doing a lot of things just to counter the influence of China in this region. And that also tells us about another alliance called AUKUS. Australia, United Kingdom, and United States, which was announced in 2021. What was the objective? The objective was that Australia should be given nuclear powered submarine to counter the influence of China in this region. According to this agreement, the nuclear powered submarines of UK and US on rotation will also base in Australia, so that there is a military presence of United States, UK, who are friendly countries to each other, who are also allies to each other against the rising influence of China. But India does not want this Quad to become a military alliance or a military bloc against China. Since the year 2008, when Indo-US nuclear deal was signed, after that multiple agreements were signed between India and United States, logistics, so on and so forth. But India does not want that impression should be given to China that this Quad is primarily meant to counter militarily China. United States is not only looking at China from Quad's perspective, is also looking at China from AUKUS, and it is also supporting and giving military assistance to Philippines. Because on various islands, shoals in Philippines, there is a conflict between Philippines and China. So United States is trying to bring all these adversaries of China, all those who are suffering because of the Chinese influence in this region, to come under some sort of United States-led military alliance. And military alliances like NATO, where if a country wages a war, declares a war against one member of the NATO, it would mean that this country has declared war against all the countries who are part of this North Atlantic Treaty Organization called NATO. But India does not want this Quad to become Asia's NATO. How Quad will come up in future, whether there will be a secretariat for the Quad so that there is much coordination amongst these four countries. In fact, if you know, India is the only non-ally in Quad. All the other three countries, whether it is Australia, whether it is Japan, whether it is United States, all these are allies to each other, which means a war against Australia will be the war on United States. War against Japan will be the war against United States, but not India. India is not an ally of United States, although India is a strategic partner of United States. And how the squad will come up in future, we will have to wait and watch. For this, I have prepared a mains-based question for you that I will discuss towards the end of this lecture. Let's look at another column, brace for the new threat to air passenger safety. Now, this is in the backdrop of what happened in Lebanon, what happened to the activists or terrorists or the leaders of Hezbollah, which is an organization in Lebanon backed by Iran. Not just Hezbollah, also the Houthis of Yemen, also the Hamas of Palestine, they are also backed predominantly by Iran. Allegation is that Israel's intelligence agency, Mossad, somehow infiltrated into the supply chain, because Hezbollah, once the war between Hamas and Israel broke out, which happened after October 7, when the terrorists from Hamas, they crossed the Gaza-Israeli border, and killed the Israeli civilians, took some of them hostages as well, including women, children, and elderly. After that, Hezbollah thought that we should not be using the mobile phones, mobile sets for our communication, because Israel is meant to be very advanced in surveillance. So they can hack into our phones and it will compromise our intelligence. That is why they started resorting to the use of pagers. And now it is argued that the company which was responsible for giving the contract for supplying these pagers to Hezbollah, the supply chain was infiltrated by Israel's Mossad. Explosives were planted inside these pagers, and ultimately these explosives exploded, which led to the deaths of people as well, and thousands of people, including the Iranian ambassador, were injured in these pager attacks. This is something that we have discussed previously. Chetan sir also has made a beautiful detailed video on these pager attacks allegedly perpetrated by Israel's Mossad and what is the implication of that. But be that as it may, the point is, does this have an impact on our air safety? You would know as soon as you board the plane, when the plane is about to take off, you are asked to switch off your mobile phones or turn your mobile phones in an airplane mode. Why? Because otherwise there will be conflict between these signals and the signals that go to the cockpit. You would also know that there is something called autopilot. For example, the plane takes off and then the destination is basically set, and even if the pilots are sleeping, the plane will travel towards its destination at an altitude which has been fixed, at the frequency which has been fixed. That's something that we call autopilot. And there are some planes and some airports which should support it, where even the landing can be on an autopilot basis. But this writer says, why did the airlines insist on switching your phone on an airplane mode? Why? Because it is argued that one crash took place because one phone was connected to the communication system, incoming call was received, which infiltrated or which violated or interfered with the signal which should have gone to the autopilot, and ultimately the plane crashed. And that is why we argue, that is why this writer argues that everybody is ordered to turn the phone on an airplane mode as soon as the flight is about to take off. Although nobody cares about this, seldom people turn their phones on an airplane mode. But be that as it may, what if now what happened with the pagers would happen with the phones as well, with the other communication devices that we use as well? Because now there are airports in Beirut which have restricted the carrying of these pagers onto the flights. But we are all carrying mobile phones. What if there is another rogue state which will infiltrate into our mobile phones and ultimately would plant explosives. And in the mid-air, these explosives will explode and ultimately it will be detrimental to the air safety. Because there was a time when airplanes could have been hijacked for political purposes. Now you don't need to hijack the plan. You don't need to conceptualize a plan to hijack the plane. What you need is to insert explosives into the communication devices, explode them mid-air, and then it will lead to catastrophe. Because if the explosion takes place, then the oxygen masks will come down. But oxygen and explosion, the fire, it's a detrimental combination. Now you will be in a catch-22 situation. If you will use this oxygen mask, you will die because of the fire. If you will not use it, then oxygen will not reach your brain, and at an altitude of 30,000 above or 50,000 above, there is hardly 5, 8, 9 seconds for you to get access to oxygen. If you can't, then you are brain dead. So what has happened in Lebanon because of the alleged attack by Israel's Mossad? Then this writer, captain, saying that we should brace for new threat to air passenger safety. Clear? That's something that you should know. Let's look at another important editorial, Sri Lanka's verdict. Now, Sri Lanka and India, they hold special place for each other in our political spectrum. We have cultural ties with Sri Lanka. We have economic ties as well. We have people-to-people contacts in large numbers between India and Sri Lanka. And now in Sri Lanka, a Marxist leader known as AKD, Anurag Kumara Dissanayaka, has been elected as the president of Sri Lanka. Clear? And in fact, Indian ambassador to Sri Lanka, he was one of the first to pay a visit to the president-elect, Mr. AKD. He defeated Ranil Wickremesinghe, he defeated another candidate, in fact, the son of the former president of Sri Lanka, Mahinda Rajapaksa. His son, he could gather only less than 3% of the votes. But in Sri Lanka, a leader, in order to be elected as the president, should get majority of the votes, which means more than half of the votes. And if in a contest, no leader, no contesting candidate bags more than 50% of the votes, then there is a second round of counting. That's something that you would know in case of preferential systems, where you have to give your preference to the candidates and then the preference votes, they shift. And this is a practice in Sri Lanka as well. This is something enshrined in the Constitution of Sri Lanka, which was enacted in the year 1978, but now has been used for the first time since 1978. Because when the first round of counting took place, nobody got the required number of votes, nobody got the majority. Then Ranil Wickremesinghe, who was at serial number 3, he was eliminated from the contest. And now the contest between the two candidates, and Mr. AKD bagged more than 50% of the votes and ultimately is the president-elect. How significant is this? That is something that we need to understand. Will Sri Lanka go back to the China's lap? What will be the implication of this election for the Tamil minority in Sri Lanka? That is something that we will have to address. What will happen to the 13th Amendment to the Sri Lankan Constitution? That's also something that we need to understand. But the point is, the year was 1987 when India-Sri Lanka Accord was signed. Rajiv Gandhi was the Prime Minister, Mr. Jayawardene was the President of the Sri Lanka. And according to this, because of this Indo-Sri Lanka Accord of 1987, 13th Amendment was made to the Sri Lankan Constitution. Why? Because the Tamils, which are predominantly residing in the northern and eastern part of Sri Lanka, Jaffna for example, they had long felt discriminated in Sri Lanka. The Buddhist majority would discriminate against the Tamils. The Sinhala, which is the majority speaking population in Sri Lanka, the Sinhalese majority would discriminate and superimpose themselves over the Tamil minority. Ultimately, in an effort by India, India persuaded the Sri Lankan government that you should amend your constitution and provide for provinces, or what we call provincial councils. And there should be provincial council in the northern Sri Lanka as well, where the Tamils, who are in a majority in northern Sri Lanka, will have their own form of self-governance. Finances should be devolved, administrative machinery should be devolved, lawmaking power should be devolved. So basically, it was a tool for power devolution to the areas in the northern Sri Lanka dominated by the Tamils there. And this has been the bone of contention in Sri Lanka for a long period of time. For example, when Mahinda Rajapaksa was the president, for close to 10 years, he launched a massive operation against LTTE, Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam, who were fighting for a separate Tamil country in the northern and eastern part of Sri Lanka. And massive operation was conducted and launched by Mahinda Rajapaksa, and ultimately LTTE was defeated. In fact, the leader of LTTE was also captured and killed. And then Mahinda Rajapaksa, if you look at the constitution of Sri Lanka of 1978, it had imposed a restriction that the term of the president should only be for 2. That means there should be a 2-term limit for the president of the Sri Lanka. After that, you can't contest election. There was a limit that those who are holding dual citizenship, they should not be allowed to contest election. But then when Mahinda Rajapaksa was the president, constitution was amended. 19th Constitutional was amended. 19th Constitutional Amendment Act was made to the Sri Lankan constitution, under which this 2-term limit was removed. Those even with dual citizenship could contest election, and this was meant to ensure that the brother of Rajapaksa, Gotabaya Rajapaksa, who had US citizenship as well, he is also allowed to contest election. But before he could do that, he gave up his US citizenship, came to Sri Lanka, became the president of Sri Lanka, replacing his brother, and then he made Mahinda Rajapaksa the prime minister. So what are you saying? I'm saying election, the 9th presidential election was conducted in Sri Lanka, in which a Marxist leader, Mr. AKD, has won the election. What is the impact of this on India? What is the impact of this development when it comes to Sri Lanka's relationship with China? What will happen to the Tamil minority in Sri Lanka? What will happen to this 13th Amendment? For that, we need to know a bit about the history. When the Constitution of Sri Lanka was enacted in 1978, it imposed a limit that the term of the president should be 2. There should be a 2-term limit on the president. Those who have dual citizenship should not be allowed to contest the election. Mahinda Rajapaksa, when he became the president of the Sri Lanka, he launched a ruthless war against LTTE, which according to United Nations, one of the worst human rights violations were committed against the Sri Lankan Tamils by the government, by the army in Sri Lanka. But then the war got over, LTTE was defeated, but then this 2-year limit, which had to be overturned, for that Gotabaya Rajapaksa, he contested the election, became the president, constitution was then amended, this 2-term limit was removed. And when Gotabaya Rajapaksa became the president, he appointed Mahinda Rajapaksa, his brother, as the prime minister, as well as the finance minister. These are the 2 important posts in Sri Lanka. And in fact, there were 5 members of the Rajapaksa family who were given ministerial positions by Gotabaya Rajapaksa. But then there were massive protests in Sri Lanka in 2022. which ultimately led to the resignation of Mahinda Rajapaksa, resignation of Gotabaya Rajapaksa, resignation of all the family members as well. They had to even flee their palace. Why? Because there was economic problem in Sri Lanka. Power cuts were imposed, electricity cuts were imposed, the prices of essential commodities increased. There was no fuel in Sri Lanka. This is where India helped Sri Lanka and sent tons and tons of crude oil to Sri Lanka and helped Sri Lanka. But the point also is, under those severe economic conditions, they had to go with a begging bowl before IMF and they had to call for bailout. It was in this backdrop of economic problems that Sri Lankan faced that AKD promised anti-establishment image, that we need to do away with these traditional politicians in Sri Lanka who have captured power for so many decades without any material change in the lives of the Sri Lankans. And now what AKD is going to do, that we will have to see. And what AKD has said in his election campaign is, we are not going to pull out of IMF. We are going to renegotiate these terms with IMF. In fact, all the candidates who contested elections this time in Sri Lanka, they all focused on the economic problems faced by Sri Lanka. And AKD is not calling for scrapping this IMF agreement, but is only calling for renegotiating it. He was once opposed to this provincial autonomy which was given to the provinces under the 13th Amendment of the Sri Lankan Constitution. But now he says we will hold elections as well. In his election manifesto, he has also spoken about the concerns of India. And he has said in his election manifesto that we will not allow the Sri Lankan soil or Sri Lankan ports to be misused against India. And let's not forget Hambantota port, which was built in the city of Mahinda Rajapaksa, his home city. It was funded by China. And when Sri Lanka could not repay that loan, operation of that Hambantota port is given to China. What this presidency of Mr. AKD will do to India, to Sri Lanka's relationship with China, to the 13th Amendment to the Sri Lankan Constitution, that is what we need to keep track of. That's an important thing that is important for the civil services examination. Clear? Let's look at something else. What is the controversy regarding the Venezuela elections? If you look at Latin American countries, whether it is Venezuela, whether it is Cuba, whether it is Bolivia, whether it is Ecuador, whether it is Nicaragua, all these countries have anti-US sentiments. Because after the Second World War, which led to the emergence of United States as a big superpower on the world map, the entire foreign policy of United States was focused on how do we curb the emergence of communism in the newly independent countries of Asia, Africa and Latin America. That was their singular objective of their foreign policy. And with Cuba, they have had their own history of relationships. And in fact, the Cold War, as we call, between United States and USSR, it was precipitated by the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. But be that as it may, Venezuela, it was under the control of the President Hugo Chavez. And there are a couple of important things that we need to study here from the civil services examination point of view. But before that, we will discuss something related to the history of Venezuela. Venezuela was from 1999 to about 2013. It was under the presidentship of Hugo Chavez. Hugo Chavez died, and then Mr. Nicolas Maduro, he became the president of Venezuela. And now elections were to be held to elect the new president. And it is argued that this election was not free and fair. In fact, Mr. Maduro should have lost. His opponent, Mr. Gonzalez, should have won. But then the government is saying, the election commission is saying, it is Mr. Maduro who has won the election. But people are aware that the elections have been rigged. It has not been free and fair. Now there are protests. And in these protests, close to 24 civilians have lost lives. But what we need to understand from the civil services point of view, a couple of things. Number one, Venezuela is considered to be a petrostate. That means when the oil reserves were discovered in Venezuela, its economy was driven by the export of the oils. And such a state is what we call the petrostate. But listen to me carefully. If you are only focused on oil and the export of oil, and you neglect other sectors of the economy, it is going to be devastating. That is why if you look at Saudi Arabia under Mohammed bin Salman, MBS, he is trying to diversify Saudi Arabia and he wants a post-oil Saudi Arabia to emerge. Why? Because we cannot always depend upon the oil exports. But with the oil exports, something else happens. And that is something that you should know called a Dutch disease. Now, what is a Dutch disease? If you are a petrostate, your economy is heavily dependent upon the export of oil to the other countries. When you export oil, that means you will get money in the form of dollars, which means your local currency will be appreciated. It will have a good value. But if your currency has an appreciative value, but your other sectors are not doing good, which primarily means you are restricting the exports of these other sectors as well. Because you would know, if the currency has been devalued, economic concept, if the currency has been devalued, exports of that country are at an advantage because they will get, their products will get a competitive price advantage in the global market. But if your currency has been overvalued, then other sectors, their exports, they will not have the competitive advantage, price advantage in the market. And this is what we call Dutch disease, where your one sector is growing, but because of that, what happens? The other sectors are neglected. And if your entire economy is dependent upon the export of oil, but the prices of crude oil is also fluctuating. When it is also fluctuating, there was a time when in 2014, 15, 16, when there were massive protests in Venezuela because the prices of essential commodities increased. The inflation was skyrocketing. There were protests and the Venezuela government imposed the wrath of the police, the army, and killed a lot of protesters. This is where United States came into the picture and imposed sanctions on Venezuela. But then happened the Ukraine war, which impacted the export of oil, the price of oil in the global market. There were restrictions on the export of oil by Russia. Sanctions were imposed on Russia. Since United States and the world, they needed stable supply of crude oil, some of the sanctions against Venezuela were relaxed. And Venezuela had promised that you revoke these sanctions and we promise we will hold free and fair election in Venezuela. But this free and fair election was only a mirage because two other candidates who were supposed to contest elections against Mr. Maduro, they were disqualified. And now the third candidate, Mr. Gonzalez, who has won the election according to media, but he has been denied victory because the election results have been rigged. Because in Venezuela, they have the electronic voting machine, and just like our VVPAT, a printed slip also comes which tells you who is the candidate against whom you have voted. And then at the end, all the candidates, they get their printed receipts. That's what we call the tally sheets. But these tally sheets were not provided by the election authorities. election authorities say it has been hacked. But look at the far-sightedness of the opposition. Civil society and others, they came together. They anticipated that Mr. Maduro will do something of this sort 9 months ago. And they had organized workshops, awareness campaigns, through which now they have got the tally sheets, because people were already aware what is going to happen. They had already prepared the tally sheets, and these tally sheets say Mr. Gonzalez had polled 67% of the votes. So basically he has won the election. What is going to happen in Venezuela, how it will impact the price of the crude oil as well, that is something that we have to keep a track of. But since Venezuela is anti-United States, and those who are other countries who are anti-United States, for example, China, Cuba, Iran, Russia, they have congratulated already Mr. Nicolas Maduro for winning the election. So what is happening in Venezuela? What is this Dutch disease? The concept of a petrostate, and how free and fair election is an important aspect of any vibrant, flourishing democracy. That's something that we need to know from this topic. What is the controversy regarding Venezuela's elections? Clear? Let's look at another column, Judicial Appointments and Disappointments, written by former Supreme Court Judge, Mr. V.R. Krishna Iyer. And I think here is a mistake. The Hindu says that this was published. This is an archive basically. This was published in 2021. But I think it should have been 2012, not 2021. You know how the judges are appointed in India through a system of collegium system. And I don't think there is a need to explain this in detail, because I think you're already aware of it. And those who are our enrolled students, we have covered it multiple times. What this column, basic crux, I will tell you. What this column is trying to say is that in 1998, when this collegium system was given a stamp of authority on the basis of the advisory jurisdiction of the Supreme Court under Article 143 of the Constitution, because how these judges are to be appointed, there was a conflict between two judge bench decisions, between two decisions of the Supreme Court. One was in 1981-82, S.R. Gupta versus first judge's case. Then there was the second judge's case. And it was in the second judge's case that the collegium system got invented in India. The first S.P. Gupta case and then the second judge's case, they were in conflict with each other. And ultimately the president sent this matter to the Supreme Court, asking the views of the Supreme Court on this matter as to how should the judges be appointed to judiciary. And this was a presidential reference which was given in 1998. Justice Verma was the Chief Justice of India. And Justice V.R. Krishna Iyer says, this judgment was given by the Supreme Court by a wafer-thin majority of 5:4. 5 judges were in favor of collegium system, 4 were not. That is why we need to change the system, because this entire system is opaque. Why is it opaque? Because we need to investigate, according to V.R. Krishna Iyer. What we need to investigate is what is the character of the candidate. Whether he has a class bias, because although Constitution says we are socialist, but V.R. Krishna Iyer says we are socialism only on the paper. We have to ensure that these judges who hold an important position in our Constitution, they don't have class bias. They don't have even communal leanings. And all this should be investigated. But V.R. Krishna Iyer says not by the police, because they function under the government. But all these should be investigated by an independent, secret investigation agency. This is how we can link it to the collegium system. Even if you are in favor of collegium system, you don't want something like the NJAC, National Judicial Appointments Commission, to come back in any form. But how do these members of the collegium system debate, discuss, and zero in on a particular name, and for this name to be appointed as the judge of the Supreme Court or the High Court? We don't know. But we need to reform collegium system by having an independent secret investigation agency where all the names which are to be deliberated upon by the collegium system, all these names should be properly investigated by an independent secret investigation agency, so that we come to know what is the character of this candidate, what is the class bias of this candidate, whether he has a caste bias, what is the ideology of this judge, whether he has some communal leanings also. That is something we can supplement with the collegium system. Then maybe collegium system would become an acceptable system of judicial appointments. Because there was an allegation that one judge was appointed to Madras, Miss Victoria, and she has had the history of making inflammatory communal speeches. Miss Victoria Gowri. There have been instances where after the judges, they retire. Recently, there was another controversy where some of the Supreme Court judges, they attended the legal meeting of the Vishwa Hindu Parishad. What if tomorrow there are judges who will attend the meetings of the Jamaat-e-Ulama-e-Hind? So we have to ensure that these judges, they are not only giving justice, they are also impartial without any communal leanings or without class bias or caste bias, or if we can ensure even without a political bias as well. And for that, we need an independent secret investigation agency. That's something that you need to know from this article. Let's look at some data pointers for mains, because in mains, when the questions are asked, you need to supplement those answers with data, with statistics. And if you add statistics, relevant statistics, you will be more likely to fetch more marks than others. For example, when issues surrounding women and women's security, women's contribution to the labor participation is concerned, this data set is important. And this data set is sourced from ILO's, International Labour Organizations, ILO Stat Data Explorer. This is in the aftermath of what happened with a young, promising lady who was working at the Ernst & Young EY in the audit department, and because of the work pressure, sometimes the deadline was given, the work was given in the evenings or at the night, and the deadline to meet that work was in the morning. So extreme pressure, the toxic workplace ultimately resulted to the death of this young, promising lady. And in fact, when her funeral was also conducted, there was no one from EY who represented the organization at the funeral. Then the mother of this lady shot a letter to the chairman of the EY, who regretted and then basically said that maybe it is not work pressure which is responsible for her death, because the same work pressure is for everybody. Just because others are tolerating toxicity, that does not mean that there is absence of the toxic environment. And what are the data sets that we need to understand? If we look at chart 1, Indian women. If Indian women, they are working in, let's say, information and communication jobs, they work 56.5 hours every week. There are some companies which have 6 days a week work. There are some which have 5 days. If we take an account that this work week is of 5 days, then it amounts to 11 days, 11 hours of work per day. If it is for 6 weeks, then it amounts to 9 hours. Similarly, in other countries, for example, what is the percentage of women in India who work in information and communication jobs? It's only 8.5%. What is the percentage of Indian women who work in information and communication? It is 19.8. Who work in professional, scientific and technical activities? It is 8.5. And there are 100 other countries where there is a higher share of women in these professions than India. So there is a disparity. So first data point that you need to understand is that the percentage of Indian women who work in professional, scientific and technical activities is only 8.5%. The percentage of Indian women who work in information and communication professions in India amounts to 19.8, but there are 100 other countries which have a far higher share of women in these courses, in these professions than India. And in fact, Indian women who are working in information and communication jobs, which includes IT professionals, journalists, they work 56.5 hours every week, although less than what Mr. Narayan Murthy argues, 70 hours a week. But then there are women who are working in professional, scientific and technical activities. And this lady, Anna Sebastian, she belonged to this category. They work close to 53 hours a week, which means professional Indian women, they work the most hours globally. Young Indian women in professional jobs, they are working for over 55 hours a week. And yet, people allege that women do not work hard inside the offices. Yet when it comes to employment, the employers prefer men against women. And one of the reasons often cited for that is the Maternity Benefit Act of 2017, which imposes an obligation on the employer that you have to give 26 weeks of paid maternity leave to women for 2 children, for 2 pregnancies. And this discourages employers from employing the women of young age or fertile age, because employers feel, they are apprehensive that if we hire them and then they will have to go for paid maternity leave, what will happen to our work? In other countries where there is maternity benefit, where there is maternity leave, the burden, the economic burden is shared by the government and the employer. But that is not happening in India, because in India, the ultimate burden is on the employer, not on the government. So maybe we need to tweak it to say that half of this burden will be shared by the state government, half of it will be borne out by the employer. Clear? Let's look at 2 practice questions for your mains answer writing. The prevalence of misinformation or false information is a problem that requires to be tackled, but it cannot be an excuse to create a mechanism by which the government becomes a judge in its own cause or the sole arbiter of what information about itself is misleading. Comment. Question number 2, India's participation in the Quad has significant geopolitical implications, particularly in the context of its relations with China. Analyze how India's role in the Quad influences its strategic approach towards China, with special reference to our security, economic interests, and regional stability. This is about today's analysis of the Hindu newspaper. I'll see you again tomorrow at 10 o'clock in the morning. I'll see you again today at 6 p.m. where we will discuss executive chapter of this book, Our Constitution at Work, which is a textbook in political science for class 11th, an important fundamental source for your polity preparation. Should you wish to get the PDF of this lecture, you can find it in my Telegram channel. The link is provided in the comment section. And if you have understood all the topics that we discussed today, then don't forget to press the like button, drop in your comments, and not to forget, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Thank you for watching. Have a great day. Bye-bye.